This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
Armenia has a very rich history of the Christian religion. Thaddeus and Bartholomew came to Armenia in the 1st century and evangelized to the people then. And then in 301, King Tiridates III officially converted to Christianity and made it a Christian nation. And so it's considered the first Christian nation in the world.
Yeah, so like geographically, the first Christian nation in the world.
Yes.
And I've noticed we were talking to Mariam Waba about Coptic Christianity, and the first thing out of her mouth as well was that Mark went down to Egypt, right? And so there's an apostle comes and establishes the church, and same thing with Malabar Coast Indians, right? The apostle Thomas comes and establishes the church. Is that important to the identity of Armenian Christianity? Could have been anonymous Christians, or is it why is the apostle so important for them?
So the main Armenian church today is known as the Armenian Apostolic Church. So having a sense of the apostolic identity is essential to the tradition. They have a continuous line of succession since the first Catholicos, Gregory the Illuminator.
Gregory the Illuminator or Eliminator?
Illuminator, yes.
Okay, just making sure, because, in Christian history, it could go either way, right? I could imagine some people might get a little bit haughty about the idea that they come from the apostles, and maybe might even think things like, well, we do it right because we come from the apostolic tradition. Do you get any sense of that in Armenian or maybe even Coptic or Syriac Christianity?
I think there is a sense of pride in general. Armenians are very proud people. We love being Armenian, and we love the right of being the first Christian nation. I don't know, though, if that's the exact source of the pride in the church. And I think in Protestant circles, there's some sense of apostolic succession, too, that the faith has been passed down
right
from person to person over the centuries.
Yeah, okay, so we shouldn't go any further without talking about some of the most famous Armenians in the world. You knew this was coming.
Yes.
Okay, the Kardashians, right?
In America, the Kardashians.
Yes. I think in the world, they might be the most... Do you know of any more famous ones? So I learned from an Armenian student that if somebody has an IAN at the end of their name, chances are they are probably Armenian. Is that correct?
That is true. So it's the word for son of, and I think some Indians too will have the YAN. In Armenia, it tends to be a Y, transliterated with a Y instead of an I. So you might get an Indian, but most likely it's an Armenian.
Okay, and so I mean, no joke. The show being the Kardashians, they take a pilgrimage to Armenia, and they actually go to churches. And I mean, people who probably never thought about world Christianity or ancient Christian history at all are now learning about it through the Kardashians. Do you think, okay, on the whole, is this a plus or a minus?
I was unaware of that.
Oh, yeah.
I don't follow a lot of pop culture, but I think anything that would draw attention to the churches in Armenia, it's so valuable. Right now, many of the historic churches going back to the Middle Ages are under threat, I guess, in the region of Artsakh, which is the disputed territory in Azerbaijan. So it's very painful, I think, to have the ongoing threat of conquest or lack of care for those churches, just for political reasons.
Yeah. And there was recent military action. Is it still ongoing from Azerbaijan attacking Armenia?
Yes, so there is a blockade right now. Armenia lost the war in 2020, and so Azerbaijan recaptured some of the territory in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is known within Armenian circles as Artsakh. And right now there's one corridor, the Lachin corridor, which is being blockaded by Azeri eco-activists. And so it's been going on for over a month now. And it's a dire situation. And I think the language of genocide is being used again, where people feel that there is an ethnic campaign, an ethnic cleansing campaign being started again.
And what, if you were to summarize that, is that a political or religious, or all political problems are religious in some ways? Is that based in a religious difference or a political dispute, or both?
It's something I've been wondering about. I don't know what the case would be if Armenians had been Muslim, but it seems to be political, ethnic, and within that is the religious difference.
Yeah. Real quick, what language do they speak in Armenia?
We speak Armenian, so there are two dialects in Armenian. It's Eastern Armenian, and then there's a Western dialect that is spoken primarily in Lebanon and Syria.
And is that Eastern and Western? Is this like New York English and Alabama English, or when you say dialects, like how strongly different are the dialects?
My understanding is that people in Armenia can understand Western Armenia better than people who speak Western Armenian can understand the Eastern dialect. I think there's a difference grammatically and in terms of some vocabulary.
Okay. That's always the way it is. One group can, like in Brazil, people who speak Spanish can understand Portuguese typically better than people who speak Portuguese can understand Spanish. I don't understand that. But, and of course, one of the, in the 20th century, one of the largest features of the Armenian people that in world history was the Armenian Genocide. How has that featured into the history of the church in the 20th, 21st century? Like, is that essential to their identity, or is that just kind of like a dark spot in the history that nobody wants to talk about?
It's central to all Armenian identity, including the identity of the church. So I was thinking about the history of Christianity in Armenia in preparation for this, and I realized that there was a battle in 451, the Battle of Arvayar, which Armenians lost. Back then it was a battle against the Persians trying to defend the Christian faith against Zoroastrian incursion. And I realized that there's some premonition of martyrdom in the 5th century, that there would just be a history of conquest and turmoil. And I think in the 20th century, that just shaped the entire course of Armenian life. So there's an Armenian diaspora because of the genocide. It's thought that 1.5 million Armenians were killed, which was 3/4 of the Armenian population at the time. And then what happened after that in 1920, when Armenia became part of the Soviet Union, there was a real consequence to the apostolic church at that time, that it was under Soviet influence and control. And I think even to this day, the church in Armenia is trying to recover from that.
Is there an anti-Soviet sentiment? Because I feel like the Christianity in Armenia, it's not Russian Orthodoxy, so it doesn't get any of that soft privilege of the state. So where did it fall under the Russian bloc?
Yes, my sense is that there was Russian political influence over the Catholicos and the head of the Armenian church, so that there's a very complicated history of relationship between Armenian Christians in the Middle East and Armenian Christians in Armenia. But it seems as if the Russian influence was more political, I guess I would say, rather than ecclesiastical.
Okay. And so if you were to walk into Armenian communities and churches today, so we talked about before we got recording in California, there's a fairly large Armenian community, including the Kardashians. Is there anything that Armenians are, if I could pause that question for a second, is there anything Armenians are known for? Like, are they known to be almond farmers? Are they known to be fisher? Is there something, certain industries that they're famous for?
Chances are you've had an Armenian dentist, or you could find an Armenian dentist. Certainly, the carpet business is filled with Armenians, the jewelry business. There are certain fields that Armenians flock towards.
So there are, like with Jewish diaspora, there are actually very historical reasons why Jewish people are in certain industries, especially in the East Coast in America, because they weren't allowed to participate in some industries. Is that the same for Armenians, or it's just like chain migration of industry? Some person got into it, they found there was money in it, and their family gets into it.
It probably depends by industry. Certainly, the carpet business came over from Armenia, Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria, but then the dentistry, I think, is probably just a function of wanting to succeed here, and it's close to being a medical doctor. I also think there's a large tradition of Armenians being self-employed, and that there was some security of being your own boss in a number of lands where there could be hostile forces.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, going back to the Armenian churches outside of Armenia. So you're in Pennsylvania. There's an Armenian community there as well. Where else would where the hot spots of Armenians in North America?
Yes, absolutely. So in the Boston area, Boston and Watertown, and then also Worcester. So that would be the Massachusetts block. That's the second largest community, I believe. So California is the first with about 200,000 Armenians. And in the Fresno part of California, certainly you would have Armenian almond farmers and
Oh, they really are almond
farmers.
Oh,
they really are.
Oh, I thought I was pulling that out of the air. Okay.
No, and in fact, actually, raisin, I think one of the head raisin companies in America is led by an Armenian family.
I must have heard that at some point, and some tacit knowledge I had of that. Okay.
There you go.
So that's Fresno. Anywhere else in the U.S.?
Well, certainly. So Los Angeles, within California, the Glendale area, it's little Armenia. You can walk in and speak Armenian in stores. Detroit has a large Arab population and also a sizable Armenian community there. And then in New York, in fact, in Murray Hill, not too far from where you might be, it used to be called Little Armenia, and that's where St. Vartan's Church is, which has one of those very traditional Armenian architectural styles for a church.
Oh, nice. And so there's Armenian Orthodox, there's Armenian Catholic, is that correct?
Yes.
And then Armenian Protestant, and you're a pastor in an Armenian Protestant church. Is Armenian spoken in all of those liturgies?
Yes, a very good question. So in the Armenian Apostolic Church, classical Armenian is spoken, Karapar, and that's not widely understood by the laity. I think in the Armenian Catholic Church, Karapar is spoken as well. It's
post-Vatican II, of course.
Yeah, and I think I was reading about this, that the commitment in Armenian Catholic churches to maintaining the Armenian language is motivated by a different set of concerns than Catholics who wanted to keep Latin.
Right.
And then in the Armenian Protestant Church, we have a good mix of Armenian and English, but it's predominantly English in the congregation that I lead. Okay.
And is there any I don't know, when I was in the Church of Scotland, there was a little bit of pressure that the pastor would pronounce blessings in Scots or Gaelic. Is there any pressure, kind of like the real stuff is in Armenian and all this other stuff we do is in English? Is there a sense like that with the language? Is there a spiritual sense to the language?
I feel something in my own spirit when I hear people pray in Armenian. There's something very precious about that. I heard it said that if you wanted to curse, you would curse in Turkish, but if you wanted to pray, you would pray in Armenian.
I mean, there's something like that in Israel. All Israelis will tell you there are no curse words in Hebrew. All their curse words they use are Arabic, right? That's funny. If is there such a thing as a typical Armenian Protestant church? I can imagine the Apostolic Church and the Roman Catholic Church follows very standard liturgies and patterns, but do the Protestants, are there 10,000 different Armenian Protestant churches?
There's more freedom in how we conduct our services. So there are 33 Armenian Evangelical churches in North and South America, and we have 2 different denominational affiliations, or I suppose maybe even more than that. So historically, we've been either Presbyterian or what ended up becoming the United Church of Christ. So those were the missionary organizations that sent missionaries over to Turkey or the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. And those American missionaries failed to convert the Muslims, and so they ended up converting Armenians from apostolic Christianity to Protestantism. And then they sponsored us when we came to the States after the genocide.
Okay. Well, I mean, go with what you know. That makes sense. So in your church is, if I was to walk in, what would hit me as besides maybe hearing somebody pray in Armenian or whatever, what would hit me as distinctly Armenian in your church?
I think it's our hospitality. So I lead the Armenian Martyrs Congregational Church in Havertown, and we're a small group. It's in some ways very recognizable as a mainline Protestant service. Non-Armenian Americans who are used to mainline Christianity would feel very at home in our service. But I think the thing that would hit you is the sense of really Middle Eastern welcome and love and food and all of those things.
Yeah. Food-wise, what's so special about Armenia?
We love to eat and to feed people. So there is a pretty strong difference, I would say, between the cuisine in the homeland and then what has been filtered through Lebanon and Syria. And I have a great preference for the Lebanese and Syrian ways of doing things.
It's not hard stuff to eat, right?
Oh, it's so delicious. Yes.
Yeah. And we think about, there's that famous book by Thomas Cahill, The Gift of the Jews, or The Gifts of the Jews, right? And he kind of chronicles the various things that the Hebrew people gave the Western world. Do you feel like there's could you say there's a book to be written called The Gift of the Armenians, the Armenian Church, and specifically to Western Christianity? What do you feel like is missing or could be learned from the gifts of Armenian Christianity?
Oh, I just love that. There's a really rich biblical history, or even just the history of early Christian literature, because the country converted so early. So there are a number of texts preserved in Armenian that only exist now in the Armenian language. And so between that and just the rich illuminated manuscripts, I think that are so beautiful, that would be one of the gifts of Armenian Christianity. A couple of years ago, there was that exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum. It was Armenia with an exclamation point. And it focused on the Middle Ages, and particularly how Armenia served as a trade route, or was on the trade route in between India and China. And it was just this great cultural mixing place for that reason. But the images, actually, they're all available online. Just so many striking images.
And these are illuminated manuscripts of the biblical text, like the Book of
Yes,
Kells,
but then there would be embroideries and other art forms, I guess.
I was so hoping you're going to say recipes.
No recipes from the Middle Ages.
Biblical text, and then like an addendum with a bunch of recipes from a local church, like those potluck recipe books that churches put together. Yeah. Have you done that yet in this church? Have you put together a recipe book?
No, but I think that there have been cookbooks or recipe books circulated among the Armenian Evangelicals.
Yeah, the church I became a Christian, they had a recipe book, and I think we used it for quite a while.
One of my favorite stories with that is women from two different churches were going to work together on a bazaar or something, and the way that they rolled the yalanchi, or the grape leaves, was different. And so apparently it's almost a legend at this point.
Right.
Apparently one woman, like overnight when no one was looking, went back and re-rolled all of the grape.
Not saying that it's wrong. Yeah, I mean, this is there's this old, I heard it in the Church of Scotland, and then subsequently I've heard Jewish versions and Catholic versions of it, like the man who's stranded on an island, and when they find him, he's got 3 huts, and it's like, well, why the 3 huts? It's like, well, that's where I live, and there's the church I used to go to, right? So yeah, I can imagine that. Why is the competition for grape leaf rolling so stiff? Because the stakes are so low.
There you go.
Okay, so Heather Ohaneson, Doctor, Reverend Doctor, or are you Reverend?
I'm not a Reverend yet.
Not technically yet, yeah.
In the process.
Yeah. So Dr. Heather Ohaneson, what was the path that got you here? Like, how did you, like, what would be the direct path to get to where you're at today? And then what was the path you walked?
I don't know if there is a direct path for other women to leadership in Armenian churches right now. In a way, you have to come in through the back door, which is how I got there. I grew up in what we call American churches, but basically non-Armenian Protestant churches, and even fairly conservative ones. So when I graduated college in 2003, I was interested in going to seminary then, but nobody really affirmed that as a possible calling for me. So I did the next best thing and got a PhD in the philosophy of religion.
Right. Of course.
Why not?
Yeah. At Columbia, right?
At Columbia. And I loved that. I loved studying. I loved teaching. I taught in Christian universities for 6 years on the West Coast. And all of that time I was involved in Armenian Evangelical circles. So back in 2006, I stumbled across the Armenian Evangelical Church in New York, which is on 34th Street in between Lex and 3rd, and was just so excited to find a place where I could have basically an English-based, sort of biblically oriented worship service, but to be with other Armenians. And let's see, eventually I asked, could I be sent to seminary? And the answer was really no. At that time, the group of Armenian evangelical churches wasn't yet ready to send a woman to be a head pastor for that purpose. So I guess through a turn of events, I found out that this church in Havertown, Pennsylvania was open to having a female pastor. And so I applied, and they took a risk on me and brought me in. And so now I'm here leading the church and going to seminary at Princeton to get the MDiv. And then the hope is to be ordained next year and to be the Reverend Doctor.
Right. Excellent. And I think to this date, I think this is true. You are the only person I have ever met who, while living in a beautiful part of West Coast, several beautiful places in the West Coast that many people would kill to live in these places because of the access to nature. Every time I talk to you, you're like, oh, I wish I could be in New York City.
I'm a New Yorker at heart.
You are like the biggest New Yorker fangirl I've ever met in my life. You appreciate more about New York City than I think even many New Yorkers who just kind of walk by and treat it like their stomping grounds. What do you love about New York so much?
I love the vibrancy of it. I love the sense that people have purpose there. There's energy, there's direction, there's ambition, there's culture. I think what I missed so much when I was on the West Coast was a sense of cultural vibrancy, and I got spoiled. In New York, you can always do something of cultural worth any night of the week, and I missed that range of options out there.
Yeah, it definitely has that. And if you were to, think about the spread of Armenian Christianity across the United States, are there corridors? Lots of chain migration, there are like veins that get tapped. So is there a reason it comes in through? Does it come in through Boston and then move to California? Do you know?
You're saying historically?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think Worcester was the first place there was an Armenian Evangelical church, although it depends on whether you count, a meeting in somebody's home. And
right,
so it's probably pretty close to the founding of the church in New York. There is an old Fresno community that predates the Armenian Genocide. There's a great story of somebody basically receiving a vision back in Armenia to flee. So
wow.
There was like a small exodus, I would say, before the genocide. So that's
straight to California.
I think maybe to LA first and then up to Fresno. But there's great historical records on this. And there was a sense, I think, that the Fresno Valley was similar to the land back home. And so that's a very, very old congregation, and I heard the story that the Armenians had been worshiping with the Presbyterians, but they were made to sit in the back because they smelled too much like garlic, and so they felt offended by that discrimination, and they left to start their own church.
That is pretty offensive.
But also maybe a believable story.
Yes, tough but fair. Yeah.
And so there are actually growing communities in Texas, Wisconsin, and Florida, and it would be exciting to see new churches being built in those places.
So, for the Jews, the Holocaust, the Hashoah, has basically determined all Jewish thinking. Even since before the 1930s and beyond, it has shaped the way they think of themselves, the way they do theology, the way they think of Scripture, the way they think of God, and the culture at large. Do you find that same kind of theological shaping in the Armenian community from the Armenian Genocide?
I think so. I think it comes out for me when I listen to contemporary Armenian worship songs. There's a strong sense of fidelity to God, to the end, no matter what. So I will not forget my faith. I will remain faithful if the sword comes. I think having lived through that and having preserved faith in the aftermath of that has given a depth and richness to Armenian faith that sometimes is lacking in other cultures.
I mean, it's interesting because for Hashoah, the Holocaust, it actually caused a lot of people to, I don't want to say lose faith because I know it's a Christianized way of saying it, but it caused them to really point back at God and say, are you the one that we're supposed to be, worship? Are you just powerful, but no longer on our side? Do you sense any of that in the community, or is it a doubling down?
I think it's a doubling down, and that's a good reminder to appreciate that. I think to take that as a grace. The term in Armenian is medzyaren, so the great catastrophe, the great crime, is the way that Armenians had referred to it before the language of genocide was, or the term genocide was created.
Well, soon to be Reverend Dr. Heather Ohaneson, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom in guiding us through this part of the church that many of us have never thought about outside of the Kardashians. But I feel like we have a great primer now before us. So thank you so much for your time.
Such a pleasure being with you. Thank you, Drew.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.